All right, so yes, my name is Rin. I'm going to talk about React Query. And Omar, I agree with you. You should learn classes. Learn classes. So this has nothing to do with classes, but you should learn them. And good job. Okay, so a big part of tonight has been really what I'm actually also talking about, which is using the right library for your use case and other musings. But basically, Sarah, I really appreciated you saying it's okay that I got it wrong, because, you know, some of us use Redux and we say, wow, it's really okay that I got it wrong. And this talk is about that. Yes, this is me. I also went to NSCC. I am from New York originally, and I just became a permanent resident. It took 17 years. Thank you. And I work remotely for Top Hat, which is an education platform thing. Such a good representative. Yeah, so TanStack's React Query. I don't know, you probably have heard of it, maybe not. Really popular. I think I said it's the basic bitch topic, so I chose it. Yeah, I think they want us to refer to it as query, just query. But yeah, I heard marketing is everything, but what do I know? I'm a software developer. Yeah, so I'm going to go over the most important parts, and obviously this is a state management library, so I'll just go over a bit about that. We're going to look at the building blocks of the queries that you make to get state, and also updating state, and the importance on how to go over the structure of setting up React Query, but the document, I would have time to go over the structure of setting up React Query, but the documentation does a great job, and I'll touch on it during our demo, because I, for some reason, chose to live code tonight, so that's going to be fun. Yeah. I use this library to essentially mitigate our use of Redux, because we essentially had, when you clicked a button on if you think about them as like avenues, when you clicked a button on 3rd Avenue, our 5th Avenue Redux store knew about it, and it really, really did not need to know about it, let me tell you. And I got frustrated with that, and so I was introduced to React Query and the amazingness that you can kind of use them together, and it's a great kind of pathway to go away from heavy bloated state. So so React Query state management library. The main motivation of this library was to succinctly handle server state in your React app while being easily understood. And the easily understood part is important to me because if you look at Redux sagas, for example, or anything that's like handling state in React, it can go south really quickly because you kind of just hope for the best and try and tell React what you want to listen to, and React may or may not do those things. Yeah. So similar to what Omar briefly touched on, a lot of devs use client-side state handling like useEffects and useState to listen for changes in server-side state. So we use front-end state to kind of wait for the server state to be updated, and useQuery kind of bypasses that by having a direct connection with that, and can listen for the state for you when it updates, and you don't need to have a bunch of trillion million use state hooks everywhere, which is cool. Yeah, and so while that like client-side state can be really good for small cases, it doesn't scale very well, and you end up with like 57 use state lines of code. And that's kind of what I was saying, that it goes south really easily because the more code you have, the the more you have to hope that you're explaining it well with your variable names and stuff like that. State gets even harder to manage when you need to persist it through your app. And so this is React Query will just make it a little bit easier to do those things. But again, I think it's important to say that Redux is not bad. Don't hurt Redux. She's trying her best. It's just what works best for your use case. Okay, yeah, so these are things from the documentation that I believe his name is Tanner, the person that develops this, but what they tried to accomplish using this library. I'm not going to go through them all, but we'll talk about them when we go through the actual code. Yes, so this is a hook library. It has use everywhere. So a query from React Query will always follow the pattern use query with some query key and some query function and optional configuration. I hope that's not too hard to read. So the some query key is a unique string, but it can also be an array to reference the piece of state internally. So when you want to go grab a piece of state, instead of doing something like, passing it down and then having a use state variable and waiting for something to change, you can just use the client provided to you by this library and grab it out of the cache. And what's great about that is obviously cache. So you can cache a bunch of data and have it organized by query keys and access it wherever you need it. And then, so some query functions, where the some query function runs when the specific query is called. This function must return resolved data or throw an error. So the query function is what actually uses a HTTP client and goes and grabs that data. And the way that, you're going to either resolve it and pass it back to a component. Because I should mention that, so if you use query in a component, which you can only use hooks in a component, because React. You're going to be it's right within, baked into the component, and this will make more sense when we go to the demo. Config, there's a bunch of properties that you can use to optimize React Query. I'm only going to touch on a couple of them because there's really just a ton. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about query keys. There you go. So a really big part of building queries is having an organized query key system. So the VIP is the variable, meaning if you want to use a variable in your query function, put it in your query key. Why? Because a query key is supposed to represent a very unique point in state. So having that variable will always keep that query key updated as the value is updated. So abstracting your query function, meaning, so see here where it says some query function. We're not doing an anonymous function within that query. We're saying we're going to call that some query function, which pretend exists somewhere else. So abstracting it, meaning calling another function somewhere else, always provide the variables. So they uniquely describe the data you are fetching. They should include any variables you use in your query function that change. So in that example, it'd be the to-do ID. So obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but most likely to-do ID will change. So our query key reflects that. Look at that sick code block Google plugin. That sucks. So so this is just the query function abstraction. So on the previous slide, we were talking about how we had that use query, and then at the end we had, for the query function, instead of doing the work right there, we were abstracting it to a separate function, and this just kind of goes over it. Why it's important that we pass in the things we're changing in the function is because we get provided a query key down there in the fetch to-do list. And as you can see with the underscore key and then our parameters, status and page, which we have in the little to-do up there, we have access to it through that, through providing it in the query. So since the query gets sent down to whatever the query function is, we'll have access to that information. Okay, sick. Okay, yeah, so a query always returns a query result. That is so helpful, Rin. Oh, that's amazing. So pieces of the query result are something like is loading, data, and error. So these come from React Query. So when you use query, parameters like this will be returned. So is loading, it's currently fetching the data. Data obviously have access to it, and error if it's in an error state. And why this is so sick is because it limits the amount of code you have to put in your components, like by far, because you have access to all of your state status in one line of code, pretty much. You can see if it's currently fetching. You could get the data right away and see if it's an error, and then display things to the user based off of that. If you were using something like Redux or another state handling library, it often makes you import different things or use functions from that library. So similar to to actually dispatch an action in Redux, you have to set up the dispatch action thing. So it's much farther apart from each other, where this is just kind of right there. So that makes things easier often. Cool. Okay. That is so small. Okay. So yeah, if we put these all together, we would get the parameters, what gets returned on the left-hand side. So we have our data, our is loading, is error, and the actual error object, and then equals use query, some query key, and then our query function. Use query always handles fetching data. So use query is the most common one, but there's also use mutation, and as the name describes, it's when you're mutating state. So when you're updating state, deleting state, creating state, those all would be mutating them, as opposed to this, where it's just the read of the CRUD. Okay, so basically, when I was saying earlier about the config options, these are just some of the ones I use most often. And that part is, where is it? At the end there. So query key, query function, and then those extra configs. And those configs really help optimize your use case. So enabled, when should this query run? Because React Query actually lets you pass in a variable saying we won't run this query, we won't run this fetch request until you tell us to, and we'll provide it only when we need it. Cache time, so what I was saying before, that you could access the cache at pretty much any time using the query client, and it stays there for 5 minutes. Select, so the cool thing about React Query is that you can handle multiple calls for data in one instance or one fetch request. So you could say okay, I want to use only this one fetch request, but I want you to select out of the the data that gets returned some kind of parameter or filter on that. And on success and on error, the usual. Okay, yeah, so this is just briefly on use mutation, create, update, and delete. Simple way to handle data over the server and invalidate the cache and optimistically update. But I don't know if we're going to have enough time to go through that too much, but I'm definitely will answer some questions. Okay, so hello, mouse. Shout out to Sir Jordan Winslow. I don't know who you are, but I'm using your Code Sandbox example. Thank you so much. I did link his Code Sandbox profile because it seemed like he had quite a few things up there if you wanted to check it out. Okay, so yeah, as I said, this is a Redux example, but I started putting some React query in here. And I'll probably have to go to my finished one because we don't have a ton of time left. And I'm also blind, apparently. Okay, yeah, so if you've ever worked with Redux before, things get segmented usually into folders based on what they do. So a saga is similar to like what we're doing with querying, which is a way to, it's a vehicle of state or fetching data. So if we go look at the users one. So right here we're saying, okay, when the user requests or users are requested, do this thing, which eventually just fetches data from this endpoint. And we put all the data in here, yada, yada, yada. So why I wanted to do this example is because if you notice, this is quite a lot of code for, just getting something. We have like 3 separate functions. This probably looks very foreign to you if you're not super comfortable with state management, because you're just like yielding a bunch, and that's why it's really cool where you can use something like React Query. So this is the same app, and it's doing the exact same thing, except instead of using Redux for this state here, it's using React Query. So if I bring up hello, Code Sandbox, please. Okay, yeah, so this is the same user function, our user saga file, and I made it so we could have a hook that does the exact same thing, and we can kind of talk about it. Oh man, this is a test. Lockie, this is a test. Okay, sure. So the top will be sagas, bottom will be hooks. So as we were saying before, when we use React Query, we always need to have the pattern of use query, query key, query function. And as you can see here, I'm not using it at the top level. Does anyone want to know, or does anyone know why I'm not using it at the top level? Meaning I have to have a function that returns use query as opposed to just having something that uses, like, just accesses it here. Yes, correct. So if we go back to, if we go to the component that's being used here, and yeah, so what I changed here was there was a use effect that was requesting users, which was dispatching an action, which the saga listened for the dispatch action to fetch the users. I can barely even say that. So there's clearly a lot happening there. And so this data is doing the same thing. We're fetching it the same way, but we're just doing this instead, calling our hook use users. So and that's why, we can't do it on the top level because it's a component. So why I couldn't do it on the top level is because I put my hooks in a separate file, so I can have them all pretty and nice in their own separate file, and then just kind of use them wherever I want to use them. And obviously you would want to do that if you're going to be using these hooks a couple different places. Cool. So we went over the query keys. We went over the query function, which literally does the exact same thing. This is almost like word for word, except this person didn't have an error handling. You just handle your errors, guys. Come on. So the exact same thing. So all that's different here is that we get to use a lot of cool things. So React Query comes with dev tools, and as you can see here, we have these little user query key, and we can see it up here in the dev tools. So you can see what the data is right away without console logging. It's just a little bit nicer to look at. And the really cool thing here is that you can play around with the actions that React Query provides. So you could say, what would it happen if I refetched this data? Obviously nothing, because we're not really doing anything with it. What would happen if, what does it look like when the state is invalid? So it's stale in the cache. Invalidate means it needs to refetch because the cache is stale. Nothing, because we're not doing anything. What would you do like this? You reset it. And what would you do if you removed it from the state? And guess what? Nothing changes because it's cached. So, and we didn't invalidate. I wonder, so if we refresh it would be back, but since we removed it, it's still there in the cache, but not in our React query. You probably wouldn't do this, but it's cool to see the actions that React query provides. I will just show you. Okay, I'm out of time, but I will show you real quick just our abstraction function again. So where is it? Oh yeah, okay, so here. So there's a case that when I click on this, I want a specific user. So I passed it a user ID. And as we were saying before, since I'm going to use that user ID to fetch the user, I put it in my query key. And I have a function that is called fetch user, which is up here. And as you can see, we have access to that user ID from the query key that gets passed in. But at the end of the day, all this function does is have a fetch with the user ID at the end there. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed React Query. I used it primarily when, like I was saying, when we had a bunch of Redux state and it was bloated and confusing to use. Cool thing is you can use this with Redux. Like nothing is breaking because we're using them together, and I think that's a great, it really lends itself to slowly picking away at it. So if you have like a giant code base that it's really hard to read and you have trouble understanding what's happening half the time, you can start chipping away at creating hooks instead of your sagas. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.